Order, order, and welcome to this one-off session of the Select Committee for Science, Innovation and Technology on the work of Ofcom. We have heard from Ofcom recently as part of our inquiry into social media and harmful algorithms, but today we're very pleased to welcome representatives of Ofcom, Dame Melanie Dawes and Natalie Black. And I'll ask you to introduce yourself when you speak. But I'm going to start with my declaration of interest, because I worked for Ofcom almost from its inception in 2023 until my election in 2010. Now, the first chair of Ofcom, Lord David Curry, he made it very clear explicitly that he didn't want Ofcom to be involved in the regulation of the internet. Too big, too controversial, too complex, he said. Of course, the Online Safety Act is how the UK regulates the internet. And so I particularly am interested to know how is its implementation going so far?
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, I'm Melanie Dawes, the Chief Executive of Ofcom, and thank you for inviting us today. Well, you have the benefit of knowing those early years of Ofcom's history, which I don't, but I think back in the 2000s and even right through the 2010s, this idea of regulating social media was not something that was embraced very quickly by any jurisdiction, any government, and certainly by regulators who might have been in the frame for it. But I think what we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years in particular, the sort of acceleration in the harm, particularly to children, has led governments to act. And our own Online Safety Act in the UK, passed at the end of 2023, is one of the most ambitious pieces of legislation in this field globally. In fact, I think it is the most ambitious. How are we doing so far? Well, just briefly, Parliament gave us 18 months to get into force finalise the codes on illegal harms and the protection of children and rules for age verification for pornography providers. We've done that. We met that deadline at the end of April. Some of the rules are in force. We've already started enforcement where that is the case. And by the end of July, when the children's codes become enforceable, that will be that initial piece of work concluded. There is more still to do, so-called categorised duties and a few other quite important policy areas, but we are now already up and running driving compliance through supervision and enforcement. So for us, this has been a real turning point these last few months, and I think the industry is starting to feel that as well. They're starting to see us getting real about driving through the changes with all the tools we have at our disposal.
Well, thank you, and it's good to hear how you are progressing against, if you like, the milestones set out. But I think what most people would judge your performance by would be, or the implementation by, would be the level of online harms that are being experienced, and particularly, obviously, by children. And the Molly Rose Foundation, as you know, set up in memory of Molly Rose, who died tragically at the age of 14, who took her own life tragically at the age of 14. The foundation said recently, no one can credibly claim that Ofcom's implementation of the Online Safety Act is anything but a disaster. How would you respond to that?
Well, look, we have so much respect for Ian Russell and other parents who've campaigned on this over a number of years, and we meet with them very regularly. I meet with some of the families and other survivors of online harm, and so do my team very, very regularly. We're always very sad to hear people like Ian saying things like that, but I just don't agree on this occasion with him that the codes that we were announcing on the day that the Molly Rose Foundation said that, the children's codes at the end of April, I don't agree that they are weak and that they won't make a difference. They represent a huge change in industry practice for protecting children. We have an enormous task on our hands to now drive compliance against those rules. There's no question of that. And that is only starting now. But we're very determined to make a difference. And, you know, you're absolutely right. The proof of what we're doing and its impact will be when we see changes in the systems and processes in companies online, and also ultimately people reporting that they have less harm than they did maybe a few years earlier.
Molly Russell took her own life after seeing content which glorified and encouraged eating disorders. And we have heard evidence, the committee has heard evidence that that type of content is still online. Let me ask you this question, is there, you talk about enforcement and compliance, is there content you think that you cannot regulate? And are there online harms you think that you cannot regulate or stop or prevent?
Well, just to say on suicide and self-harm material, eating disorder content, that is harmful for children, even if it's legal for adults. Some of it is illegal, actually. So pro-suicide content, for example, is just plain illegal. Sure. But other content may not be. But the Act is very clear, and our codes are very clear, that that's primary priority content, and it must not be shown to children under the Online Safety Act. So there are measures in our codes which start with the need to have highly effective age verification if you've got children on your platform, or you're likely to, and you have that content on your platform, you must have highly effective age verification at aged 18. And secondly, under 18s must then get a different experience from adults. They must not be shown material like that, violent content, misogyny, and so on, pornography as well. So those are the rules. And can we regulate that content? Well, yes, I think we can. There are always difficulties, for companies in defining the boundaries here. But particularly when it comes to protecting children, we are expecting them to exercise caution, because fundamentally it's about how their algorithms work. They don't have to take that content down, they just have to not show it to children in their feeds. So I didn't ask your question about what we couldn't regulate, but I wanted to just explain how we can deal with that incredibly important category of content. And
I appreciate understanding that your position, Ofcom's position, is that you can regulate that content and you will seek enforcement. But just to my question, are there online harms that you believe that you cannot regulate and that you should not, or should not regulate?
Well, the Act is clear that it's about illegal harms, and there are more than 130 of those listed in the Act. Things like child grooming, the exchange of child sexual abuse material. I think we're clear that illegal content is regulated. So that's the focus for adults, and then for children, as I was explaining, that broader category of content. What's not covered is so-called legal but harmful material for adults. There was a big debate about that in Parliament, as you know. And what's also not covered is the debate that I think we're increasingly having about the time that children in particular, but also adults perhaps, spend online, addiction and the nature of those algorithms, and some of the wider mental health harms that I think are increasingly a concern to parents, and which I completely get. And so I would not say, sitting here as the regulator, that we shouldn't regulate those things. I think when you get into legal but harmful material, it's quite difficult because of the boundary issues and the need to protect freedom of expression. But I think in the end, these broader questions are going to be asked. And I guess my job is to get on with making the internet safer. If companies can't deliver on that, then maybe they'll face more draconian rules in future.
Your job is to get on, as you say, with the job of making the internet safer, but you are recognising, I think, that there is harmful content, and particularly for adults, and we have heard of how harmful content is accelerated and pushed out through recommender algorithms, etc., harmful content which you currently do not regulate. I think that's what you're saying.
Yes, there is some harm. There are some categories of legal but harmful content which are not regulated for adults in particular. And that was a decision that Parliament made, long debated. Mis and disinformation, for example, non-illegal hate speech, and so on. So those were not covered by the Act. Although when it comes to violence against women and girls, Ofcom has already published draft guidance which sets out best practice in those areas, because they're clearly important.
I would say that the Minister certainly gave us the impression that her view was that Ofcom could regulate mis and disinformation. But we'll come back to that. I do want to just ask, before I open it up to other members of the committee, I want to ask Natalie Black a question, because Natalie, you were deputy head of the number 10 policy unit from 2015 to 2018 and director of the Internet Harms Unit from 2017 to 2018. When discussions, because the Online Safety Act took a long time to get through Parliament, when discussions about how we can or should regulate the Internet were taking place under the previous government. So are you involved in those discussions, and are you now regulating, actually marking your own homework?
Well, firstly, good morning. My name's Natalie Black. I'm the Group Director for Networks and Communications at Ofcom. As you mentioned, Chair, yes, previously I ran the number 10 policy unit and kicked off the original work around online safety. But my role at Ofcom is focused on networks and communications, so predominantly digital infrastructure. But I also lead our work on AI. But I should say that one of the great joys of working at Ofcom is that we're a collaborative team, and we work together across a whole range of issues. And certainly the companies that we engage with, for example, we regulate whether they're in online safety, but potentially under some of our digital infrastructure regulation. So I hope that explains that I have a specific role, but of course I work with colleagues across the board because these are cross-cutting issues.
Do you think the government should have started the process of regulating online content earlier when you were in number 10?
I'm not sure that's one that I can judge at the time, and this is some time ago, I mean nearly 10 years ago now. Yes. I think the world was really quite different, but certainly I think what was recognised was that increasingly tech companies were having an impact on consumers' lives in a way that probably hadn't been anticipated. And the UK at that stage was at the fore, as it continues to be today, at trying to tackle some of those very difficult issues.
Thank you. Lauren.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to ask a little bit about how you're going to drive compliance, and in particular, are you going to be searching for harms, or are you going to be waiting for the harms to be delivered and then them to be reported and then action to be taken? I'm just getting an idea of how you're driving compliance. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really important question. So the answer is a bit of all of those things. So while we were in the 18-month period of having to develop the codes of practice, we also took a conscious decision to invest in supervision teams. This is a team across Ofcom now of around 60 to 70 people working with about 50 companies that are either large, the household names that you would expect, or small and risky, and we thought therefore we needed to understand them and get under the bonnet of how they work and build some form of working relationship prior to getting into the enforcement and compliance mode. So those supervision teams will continue, and that's really important because we can't do our job unless we've got a deep understanding of how particularly some of the larger and more complex companies work. So that's what that's about, and it means we're going to be much quicker to be able to understand the risk assessments that they've all just sent us, and to be able to judge where they're adequate, where they're not, and then to be able to do the same in the measures that they're putting in place. So that supervision engagement is really important. But we also have a triage function in Ofcom which looks at any intel that comes in. So it might be a bit of journalism, it might be a report from a civil society stakeholder, it might be whistleblowing, although we haven't had that yet. It could be from any source. So that, and we have a process for taking those things and judging, is it in scope? Is it a problem? Can we do anything about it? How do we do anything about it if we think we do? So it's quite new, as you would imagine, because we're just getting into that phase, but that's quite important. And then finally, outcome reporting. I mean, this is really difficult because the industry does not measure safety. So that's very important to say. There's no existing framework for judging how you measure harm, particularly how you measure the lived experience of people as opposed to just the number of types of content on a platform. So we're developing a programme there of measuring outcomes. A lot of that will be by tracking people's views in surveys. We'll be measuring how systems and processes are being implemented, things like age verification, quite easy and tangible to measure. how the recommender algorithms, it's a bit harder to put your finger on what good looks like, but that's another programme of work that we have in train.
Just a quick one, so the anti-religious hate speech or AI-generated images that are depicting different religions in a negative light, that is illegal content?
If it's illegal, yes. I mean, it can be, yes. If it's racially aggravated or religious aggravated hate speech can be. Certainly, if it's inciting violence.
Yeah. I'll be writing to you on that space.
Good.
Thank you very much. Just before I come to Emily, you said in response to my questions that Ofcom would be enforcing the guidance and that it's set out and the codes that it's set out. But isn't one of the concerns is that where Ofcom has not provided duties, because under Section 49, a provider is complying with a relevant duty of the Act if they meet the measures relating to that duty in Ofcom's Code of Practice. So if you have not set out duties relating to those measures, then they don't need to do anything. And an example of that, is with regards to, say, recommender algorithms or with regard to misinformation.
So a few things there. So firstly, harms like misinformation, it's just not covered by it's not named as a harm in the Online Safety Act. I think that's clear. There are some offences that relate to information that are illegal. So false communications offences, foreign interference. There are a few specific offences there, but in general terms, mis and disinformation are not harms named under the Online Safety Act. So they're not covered by our codes of practice because it's legal content whereas our focus for adults in particular is illegal content. So that's just the scope of the overall Act and what it's trying to tackle. The second thing then is the safe harbour nature of the codes as it's sometimes referred to. Again, in the Act, the way that it's framed is that companies have to do risk assessments. So that's the first thing. If they find something in their risk assessment, and as I say, we're going to be absolutely scrutinising.
Sorry.
Because we've got that network, and we've got the support of...
I don't know where that came from. My apologies.
They're listening to us. Social media. They're always listening to us.
So if a company has something in their risk assessment, then, and I say we're going to be scrutinising the risk assessments of the companies we think are at this stage the most, either the biggest and the most used or the most risky. And there isn't a measure in our codes that tackles that particular risk, then we will say to them, what are you going to do about it? Just because there isn't a measure in our codes doesn't mean that they can leave a risk in their risk assessment and mitigate it.
They have to identify that
they
risk.
Do.
So
they
if they
do.
don't identify that risk,
then we don't manage to find it and challenge it. But bearing in mind that this is going to be a very evolving regime. The third thing is
can you identify risks that they don't identify?
Yes. And this is where
Even
the broader monitoring is really important and all the intel that we'll get. So again, the other thing that we will absolutely do is if we see that there's a risk that we weren't covering off or a new technology or a new system that can tackle a risk that wasn't there before, then we will adapt our codes. And in the next month, we're coming out with some new measures which will cover things like live streaming risks for children, the need for emergency response protocols when you have events such as the riots last summer, and a few other things. The use of automated content moderation. There'll be a package there where we weren't able to get it in the codes the first time around for whatever reason, but we're moving pretty fast to bring it forward now.
Okay, thank you. Emily.
Oh, thank you very much. So I've got... I guess there's a really broad question that we've struggled with within this committee is, do you think they're the same rules for online and offline content? And does the Online Safety Act regularise that?
Largely, yes. But if I was sitting here with my experts, they would immediately start to say, well, it does depend a little bit, but largely what the Online Safety Act does is say that if it's illegal content offline, then it's also illegal online, and therefore companies need to have systems and processes in place to tackle it.
Okay.
So, yes, there are a few exceptions, I think, but that is broadly what it's trying to achieve.
I think one of those exceptions that you might be talking about is violent porn.
Do you know, it's exactly what I was thinking about.
Yes, very clearly there is stuff that is illegal to show in a movie theatre, or to, when we used to have Blockbuster Video, illegal to rent, and illegal really for, let's say, publishing platforms. So the Netflix and that to be able to do, because they don't meet our standards set by the British Film Council, and if they do not have a proper rating, they are deemed illegal.
Yes, there are some categories of pornography that are not illegal online when they are illegal offline.
But exactly, and when we say offline, we some of that still is online and regulated areas, isn't it? And some of it isn't. Social media being the area that it's not. Do you think we should be moving? Do you think that's a gap in the?
Well, look, we work quite closely with Baroness Burton on her review of these issues.
Yeah.
I think she's done a really amazing piece of work there, very, very difficult work to do. So just a couple of things. When the Online Safety Act does require all of the illegal content duties of pornography providers that are user to user. So in other words, one that allow so-called creators to be on their platforms and have that direct user-to-user business model. That is increasingly the way that the industry is moving. And what that means is that those services are, in the language of the Act, so-called Part 3, and the full weight of the Children's Code and the Illegal Harms Codes therefore applies to them. And that does mean that illegal content of many types, but I would have to check exactly what the situation is around offline illegal porn. We've got some purchase on some of the issues when we're talking about those kinds of platforms. Where it's the more traditional, old-style publisher model of porn, the so-called Part 5 of the Act platforms, the only requirement on them is age verification at aged 18, which we are making good progress on, actually. But you know, keep children out of all of it is what the Act says.
Right, even if it's content that's illegal offline. And that, I think this is where some of the stuff we struggle with is how that works. It's not necessarily about creating more illegal content. It's just about regularising the position, I think. We heard very clearly from the online platforms, they were asked very, very directly in our inquiry around misinformation and the riots, whether they would do anything different now that the Online Safety Act was in place. And they very clearly said no. They would not have done anything differently. Is that your read of the Online Safety Act? Is that a problem with the Online Safety Act, or is that a problem with their interpretation of the
We don't agree with them on this.
Right.
And in fact, we sent a letter to the Secretary of State, Peter Kyle, last autumn, reporting on what we had learned from the terrible events of last summer and what happened online. And we're very clear that illegal content was allowed to circulate that showed that the right systems and processes were not in place to tackle it. Those companies that had emergency response protocols and activated them did a much better job and worked quite closely with the government, which is the other thing that we would expect to see in circumstances like this, and the law enforcement agencies. So we're coming forward with a new measure, an emergency response protocol measure in this package of extra measures that I was mentioning earlier. But we've already said in public that we think that there were quite a lot of things that the industry would have needed to do differently. Some did much better than others. Those that saw what was happening, you know, activated their systems, engaged with the government, did a good job. And it's never perfection in a time like this because things move very, very, very fast. But some didn't do so well.
Okay. And then finally, I just wanted to raise this issue around transparency, particularly around the challenge around transparency for large versus small platforms, and how reliant the Online Safety Act is on their own transparency. Do you think we have the balance right in terms of our ability, their more public or research-based transparency, so that we can hold them to account in their own homework marking? And do you think we have the balance right between the large and the small platforms? And given that this is such a big issue in terms of your own roadmap, do you find any challenges of meeting the deadlines that have been set in the roadmap because of a lack of transparency or a focus on very big, well-known platforms versus some of the more harmful, smaller platforms that go undetected, but where we know a lot of illegal activity is being shared and created?
So we believe that transparency is a very important regulatory tool. And I think, although we'll have to see, I think it'll be most effective from the larger companies who have a brand, who are widely used by the public. And that's where the transparency rules are going to be tightest, because the categorised services, which will be essentially the larger ones, not entirely but largely, we will be able to require them. We will be able to issue transparency notices requiring them to publish reports on whatever topics we've chosen. And we're going to do that as quickly as we can once we've been able to finalise the categorised service register. On smaller platforms, the transparency requirements on them are not as great as they are for the big ones. I mean, there, I think, what we have already done is open 4 enforcement investigations, just going straight to enforcement, to be honest, where we've seen small but risky platforms that have got either illegal content, in the case of a suicide forum, which we opened an investigation into in April, and then 2 porn sites and a Nudify app, which is in the last fortnight. And we're just going straight to enforcement, where we're just not getting any engagement at all, and where we have serious concern that there is a high risk to the public. So I think it's going to be different tools for different companies. Transparency is important. Should we have more requirements on smaller companies? I think at this stage, I wouldn't say that was a priority, but our whole philosophy to this as Ofcom is that we will learn a lot over the next few years. And if we think that there are things that we could do more of and we need more powers to do, we will talk to the government about that, because I think they're in that learning mode as well, to be honest.
Yeah, just to follow up on that specific point before passing over to colleagues. You've said within those transparency reports where they identify risks, you can also identify risks, so it's not just self-identified. But how are you or researchers in universities or going to identify those risks if there isn't the transparency on the data in order to be able to identify risks? It limits that credible flag raising from other organisations, does it not?
Yes, I think it does. And I think you're touching on a very important point there. We support any measure that allows researchers and external organisations to be able to go in and interrogate what's happening online. And I think, I hope I've been conveying earlier that from Ofcom's perspective, we want to have a completely open door for any information that people are able to bring us, because what we get from our regulatory relationships will be one side of the story, and a lot of that will be information no one else has got access to because it's commercially privileged. But researchers are often in a brilliant place to be able to truly do interesting research, but at the moment they can't always get access. In fact, they usually can't get access to the data that they need. So I think that's very important.
Right. Okay.
Great. Martin, you'd like to come in quickly?
Thank you, very quickly. Just so I previously worked for Ofcom for the PSA, the Phone Paid Services Authority, which now merged into Ofcom. I no longer do. I was also sitting on the Bill Committee for the statutory instrument that looked at the categorisation of services, and we were somewhat perplexed, and I still don't understand from your answers so far, why you chose not to enable the hard-won modification to the online safety bill that allowed you to put into the most restrictive categories, or the most regulated categories, those services from small but highly harmful, those small but harmful services. Now, you deliberately, in your recommendations back to the government, what you wanted in that SI, excluded that, and that perplexed us all, and it still perplexes me. Why did you do that?
Well, there are 2 reasons. I mean, first, we just don't think that part of the Act gave us the flexibility to add risk, which would have allowed you to go after smaller and risky sites in the categorisation framework. We didn't believe that we had that discretion. It's long debated. I was going through it actually last week, line by line, with our lawyers, and we were reminding ourselves of exactly where we were. And I haven't got the document in front of me, but fundamentally it is framed around reach, and that's essentially the sort of driving principle behind that bit of the Act. And so we didn't feel that adding risk that wasn't associated with reach was something that was in tune with that part of the Act. I know there's a lot of debate about that, but that's just not something that we felt was part of what we were able to do. I suppose I would then say, if you look at the duties on categorised services, in our opinion, they're not very well targeted at the risks of small but risky platforms. And actually what we've done in our codes of practice is be very, very clear that the most stringent measures against illegal harms and the protection of children apply to small but risky platforms as well as large but risky platforms. And so we genuinely believe at Ofcom that the statutory codes of practice give us what we need to take action against small but risky platforms, and we are already taking action. As I was saying, we've taken out 4 enforcement investigations only in the last few weeks, and we have 3 further programmes looking across the whole industry, which are looking at some small but risky companies as well as some big ones. So it's on the basis of the evidence we have about what we think we're able to do, but also our legal reading of that part of the Act. And we're very happy to follow up with, if you like, it almost does require you to go through line by line, I think, but we're very happy to take that offline if that's helpful.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Adam.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning both. Thank you for joining us. I just want to pick up actually on some of the points that you and Emily were making a few minutes ago, looking at transparency, and I think you had a really good discussion there about transparency of the companies that you engage with, but transparency works both ways, of course. And do you think that Ofcom should also have a duty of transparency, particularly regarding the meetings that you're having with companies that you're engaging with? And I mean the big tech firms. Obviously you've got to have those meetings, but do you think there's a duty of transparency to talk about those?
So we are required to produce transparency reports, which isn't what you're talking about, but just to be clear, there are some transparency duties on Ofcom as well in terms of our reporting. On the question of transparency about the meetings we have, I just don't think you'll find a regulator that routinely reveals the details of the companies that they're meeting, because of the need to preserve commercial confidentiality is part of it. But even just giving the names and the meetings does risk having a chilling effect on those discussions. So we've thought about it long and hard, and I completely understand the challenge, and it's a very fair one, but we are subject to freedom of information, of course, and so there are some times when, if we're asked for specific information, that will be caught by the FOI Act. But I don't think you will find regulators that are comfortable releasing information of who they talk to, because, as I say, I think it can reveal, for example, that you're very concerned about a risk and that you're talking to a company about it, and that may not be something that is helpful to progressing an investigation at that particular point in time. So that's where we are on that issue.
Okay, I take that point. I think it's moderately concerning, but I take what you're saying. Yeah, I think in a recent letter to the committee, Ofcom said that you're developing a range of ways of updating stakeholders on these meetings. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that update process looks like, and what you think it should look like in the future?
Yeah, so we are publishing a regular bulletin on supervision and enforcement, and I think that's going to be one of the primary ways that we are able to say, certainly using numbers, how many companies we're meeting, how many we're supervising, and so on. And of course, the moment we open an enforcement investigation, we're absolutely clear about the name of the company that we're enforcing against, unless, as in the case of the Suicide Forum, we think it's helpful to them to give their name, which we didn't want to do. No one names that forum in the press or the media. So I think that enforcement bulletin will be the main way, the supervision and enforcement bulletin will be the main way that we keep people updated.
Thank you. I've got a couple more questions on a different point, but I think...
Oh, yeah, carry on.
No, yeah, okay. Okay, so next point I want to talk about, and we just...
Actually, Adam, can I just come in on that point? Because I think an enforcement bulletin does not give transparency about who you're engaging with. And I remember when I worked for Ofcom, there was so much more pressure to meet the big companies like British Telecom, BT, than the small companies who often don't have the time. How can we understand the extent to which you are engaging with big tech, other than small and medium business, and particularly citizen representations? Just to say, my constituents have the impression that this is all big tech, it's all in league with government, etc. And you're kind of playing to that if you're saying that you're not willing to share how you engage with companies.
Well, I mean, look, Natalie might want to say something about this because she's, leads all our engagement with me on the telecom side, for example. But, I'm just giving you my honest answer as to why we think this could stop us being able to do our job effectively.
Could you, for example,
that's why we've taken
share how many hours you spend per week with companies over 100 million in revenue, for example, versus companies below? I mean, if we accept that commercial argument, which I'm not sure I entirely do, but if we accept that, there are ways around this to still demonstrate how you engage with a range of companies.
We're certainly very keen to be able to explain our overall approach and what we do. And we absolutely do engage very extensively with civil society. And as I was saying earlier, with bereaved families...
You're not willing to put any kind of volume on that.
But
is that something that you can look at?
We can certainly look at how we can improve on this, but I don't think we will change our view that giving names of companies is potentially quite risky for us to be able to do our job. But
Maybe
Natalie, do you want to give a perspective?
Let me give two examples, because that might highlight where some of the challenges are. So, for example, on the Telecoms Access Review, which we are running at the moment, we will receive a wide range of consultation responses. Those are made publicly available. So that's a lot of data that we put into the public domain. An area that is more challenging is cybersecurity, for example. So companies are coming to us to let us know that they are experiencing breaches. And if there is a chilling effect, as Melanie mentions, then that can increase their reluctance to come to us, which can increase the risk for the overall sector. But particularly if it's live, I mean, there are obviously a number of live cybersecurity events in the UK economy at the moment, then there are very real implications for how the threat can increase as a consequence of what information is in the public domain. But in terms of holding us to account, we are required under the Telecom Security Act to write to the Secretary of State and provide a report on progress and where there are incidents. So I use that as an example to highlight that there are levers, and we take those responsibilities very seriously. But as Melanie says, we can consider where else it might be possible to increase the volume of data.
I think it's really important that you hear the voices of businesses of all sizes and consumer groups and citizen groups. And for the moment, I don't see any way of measuring how you are doing that and how that evolves. But you'll write to us and set that out, how you take on that challenge.
Maybe just to add, not to draw out the point, but just to emphasise, I very much agree with you, because when we talk about Ofcom's responsibility for consumers, the definition of consumers is very wide, and particularly for SMEs, who are significant consumers in the economy. So we spend time with the Federation of Small Businesses, with with the British Chamber of Commerce, for example, and the Citizens Advice Bureau. And it is a question I asked my own management team: who are you spending time with? So I do want to emphasise.
Let us share some of the answer on that.
I want to emphasise, though, that is something we take very seriously: the broad definition of consumers.
All right, thank you. Back to Adam.
I think Laura wanted to come in, actually.
Very quickly, if I can. So the question is always, who guards the guards? So who are the people that can see and take a check on the judgments that you're making to ensure that transparency? So at the minute, it feels like a closed book, and we're here to trust you, which we can do, but how do we get that assurance? So if you can write to us with where those levers are. You mentioned about the Secretary of State. If that's the only one lever that can look and see what's
That
happening.
was one example.
One
Just
example.
example
If you could
then.
expand
Yeah.
on the others, that would be great.
Yeah, look, we get the challenge and very happy to take away and see how we can really improve on this. I mean, fundamentally, we're an independent regulator and we are accountable to Parliament. And this is one of the main mechanisms of
sessions like
accountability
this.
right now. And we
Okay.
take that very seriously.
Okay.
We're also accountable through the courts for our individual decisions, the companies we regulate. But fundamentally, we are trying on online safety to be as transparent as we possibly can be. We publish so much research, so much information about what we're doing. But this particular question I will take away and see how we can at least give you a much clearer picture of who we're meeting and how and what our approach is and some detail behind that.
Okay, that's great. Great.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I'm going to move on to another point. We discussed mis and disinformation a little bit earlier, but I want to pull in on a few points around that broad theme, and particularly that the Online Safety Act requires Ofcom to set up an advisory committee on mis and disinformation. But we recently heard that the misinformation and disinformation words had been removed from the naming of that committee. I was just wondering if you could explain why
And
that
why we
was.
did that. Yeah, well, so we were able to start setting up this committee when we had a non-executive member of our board with the relevant experience of online services and mis and disinformation in Richard Allen. He was appointed last autumn, and he moved pretty sharpish to set up the committee actually and get it going within 4 or 5 months. So it's now up and running. It had its first meeting on Friday. During the process of recruiting people for the committee, and with Richard's knowledge himself, what he concluded and persuaded the board of actually was that there is a broader sort of use of language going on here around information. So people talk about information disorder. I think that's a phrase that Full Fact used, for example, and sort of healthy information systems, information disorder, and so on. And so we consciously decided to do what we think is a slightly broader name here. Clearly, though, there's no question it covers mis and disinformation, false information that is misleading and harmful, either because there are public health implications or simply because news and current affairs is being degraded or because of fraud, which is very related to mis and disinfo. So we're absolutely doing what the Act requires us to do, but we thought we think this name will stand the test of time a bit better. And you will be hearing from the committee quite soon, because although they have to produce a report within 18 months of being set up, they're going to be looking at individual projects and publishing those as soon as they can. So they're going to choose topics so they can get moving quickly. And I hope that will sort of allay some of the concerns about whether we care about this, because we do, but we're just trying to set it up in a way that we think will be effective.
So it's safe to assume that despite the change, the focus on mis and disinformation is still very much the committee's primary function?
Yes, it is.
Okay. One question related to that, though. When we spoke to Mark Bunting, he indicated that one of the reasons that the name was changed was to avoid having to use the words misinformation and disinformation over and over again. How much did that aspect factor into the decision?
Well, it's all, for us, I think it's all part of the same point, that just, something that's a bit simpler, the Information Advisory Committee, will stand the test of time better, and that mis and disinformation are specific parts of that, and probably very large parts of what we're talking about, but that there is a slightly broader conversation there.
And then just on kind of timeline, just so we can understand a bit better, I think the government's statement of strategic priorities for online safety referred to the committee by its original name, supposedly more than a week after the change was announced. In terms of timelines, was that just an oversight, or was the decision made at different points? What happened there?
I suspect that was just an oversight. And the Act, the name in the Act remains, of course, so its statutory, name and functions are there in the legislation. It's just the working name that we've given it is.
And then finally, for me, just to kind of clarify, was this name change discussion held internally only, or was it done with the full discussion with and support of the government?
It was a decision by our board, but we did discuss it with the government, and that's why I think it's probably just an oversight that the language wasn't changed in their statement of strategic.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Adam. Did you
Thanks very much. So Dame Melanie and I worked together when she was Permanent Secretary at MHCLG and I was Housing Minister. And one of the issues that we faced there was the number of good planning officers who were getting poached and moving into the industry. There was a lot of frustration with Ofcom about amongst parents and groups outside about a sense of complacency. And I have to be blunt with you, the last appearance we had from Ofcom and the ICO came across to a number of us as completely complacent in addressing what we faced together. Yeah. Just exploring this theme of transparency, what does the movement look like between Ofcom and the industry and vice versa? Are you a nice career development process for future tech execs? And how many have moved from the industry into Ofcom that are at senior levels?
It's quite a small number of people who go in either direction, to be honest. And I'm pausing now. We have 2 of our directors in online safety have worked in the industry, and that is hugely helpful because they are bringing real life experience of how decisions are taken in those companies. And in both cases, they've come because they care about trust and safety, as it's known in the industry, and they want to be part of making a difference and driving changes that they weren't able to drive when they were on the other side of the fence. And then we have a few more junior people. Sometimes they go to the industry. Yes, our staff are going to be attractive. That happens on the telecom side as well, and on media. And I view that as part of people building a career in expert areas. But our board is really, really clear about conflicts of interest, for example, and making sure that there's proper gardening leave and the right sorts of fire breaks, if you like, when particularly when senior people.
How are you handling those accusations of regulatory capture?
Well, by doing the job. And I'm very sorry to hear that you thought we were complacent last time round, but we are absolutely not complacent. We have a very, very big and challenging job to do here. This is an incredibly ambitious act, rightly so.
I know, I understand.
And
you've said that
already. We really aren't complacent.
Sorry to interrupt. So do you have internal conflict mechanisms? So, for example, if I'm a former Google executive, I can't work on Google?
Yes, that's correct, for a period of time, yes. And
how long is that period of time?
Well, I can send you the details of our conflicts guidance, which, as I say, is overseen by the board. It depends by people's level in the organisation, but it also depends on the nature of the work. So, you know, the decisions that we're taking about enforcement, which I think are the most important ones of all, those are done with incredibly clear governance. I am not part of that decision making, for example. This is the same on broadcasting content oversight. It's the same when we're deciding what to do about the Royal Mail's performance each year. Those decisions on enforcement are taken with incredibly tight governance, and that's a very important part of this, so that we can be clear that where the most important decisions are taken, that they are properly objective.
And what does the flow of executives look like in the other direction? People leaving you to join the firms that they were previously regulating?
It's unusual at senior levels, but more common at more junior levels. And people will often be going to trust and safety teams, so they will be going to implement the Online Safety Act in their companies. As you can imagine, that's something that companies are often quite keen on. But I think we have to accept some risk here. So when we were working in the housing ministry together, if you've got a government department, I'm afraid government departments often really struggle with this, that has absolutely no knowledge of what it's like commercially to be in those industries, you are flying blind. You can't do your job properly. And I think that's even more important for a regulator, because we have to have a detailed understanding of the companies we regulate in a different way, even from a government department. So I think you have to accept that there are risks here that have to be managed. We're confident we manage them as well as we can, but we simply couldn't do our job if we weren't able to
no, I understand that, and I accept the need to balance risk. I've just become concerned quite recently about general regulatory capture across all our regulators. For me, the biggest one is a former Amazon executive becoming chairman of the Competition and Markets Authority, which is here is one of the most anti-competitive firms in the world. Suddenly in there. And that's my concern, because obviously you're not in every meeting. If there are, I would be concerned if it wasn't quite a long period before a Google executive who joined you could have conversations with Google or one of those other firms about their regulatory status or whatever. And you are, I mean, in a very difficult area. I understand the risk, but there's also a lot of money at stake. Right, and we know that these firms spend a lot of money on regulatory capture, not just here but around the world.
Yeah,
right. They do as much managing you as they do managing the market because they're so dominant. Right? They don't have to worry about competition, and so that's, I think, where, from a lot of people's point of view, more transparency would be welcome. I mean, would it be possible for you, for example, obviously anonymised, to write to us about the flow backwards and forwards over the last, say, 4 or 5 years?
Yes. We can do that, and I think we can also. I'd also like to paint that part of the picture, which is about civil society. So, in online safety, I believe that there are more people who've come in from the NSPCC, Five Rights, the Internet Watch Foundation, the National Crime Agency, other regulators, than there are people who've come from the industry.
That's fine.
So that's
if you're able
another
to,
quite important.
if you're able to show us the numbers in both directions, that will be.
We can certainly.
That'd be helpful.
Certainly have
the other thing, just as a small part of your declarations, your conflict declarations, do staff have to declare if they are approached by a recruiter or a firm with a possible offer of employment?
At a senior level, yes, they do.
At any
we have
level?
rules on that. We don't have rules for every single member of our staff, no. And but if people are moving to a job where there is a conflict, then if it's a very acute conflict, even if you're quite junior, then immediate gardening leave is likely to be what's required. And at a senior level, any member of my team that is approached by a headhunter about a job in our industries is expected by our board to notify me and my general counsel straight away.
Are you able to give us the numbers of notifications you've had, say, over the last 3 or 4 years? Specifically of those approaches?
The senior ones, the number's 1, I can tell you, in the time that I've been at Ofcom.
Right. Okay.
Out of my senior team. And that person, they didn't apply for the job either.
Right. Just 1 declaration?
Yes, and there haven't been any others. I'm confident of that.
Okay, fine.
Okay, thanks.
All right, if you could send us that flow information backwards and forwards, that would be very helpful. Second thing I just wanted to ask you is about the attitude you get from the firms themselves that you're dealing with. One of the impressions that I've been left with in my interaction with them, not just on mis and disinformation, but on child safety generally, is that they basically try to do the absolute bare minimum they can for compliance, right? That they feel no wider duty than that, and that even then they wriggle and squirm, and very often what they say is not actually what the reality of experience is on the platform. Is that your impression in your interactions with them as well?
We are just at that point of being able to start to judge that. We have got all the illegal harms risk assessments from the industry in. We asked for those 2 weeks after the statutory deadline. They all came in pretty much on time by the end of March, and we're interrogating those now. And I'm sure we're going to see some wriggling and squirming, yes. But it's our job to, call that out and to sit down and talk about it and ask for a different risk assessment, and as we start to look at the measures they're introducing, push harder for the measures that we were expecting. So we're going to have to make judgment calls at some point about where to escalate some of those conversations. As I said, we've already gone into enforcement action with some small but risky platforms. We've just had no engagement at all. But I agree with you. There will be some in the industry who want to do the bare minimum or even less, and wait for us to come and find them.
And it leads me on to the second question about that, which is the other impression I get is that they are actually technically capable of far more than they let on, right? So that if they really wanted to, so say for example Facebook, right? You and I both know that the vast majority of child abuse notifications in the UK come through Facebook, right? They emanate on that platform. And given that they're able to detect that I might need a new lawnmower and send those adverts to me, or given that, for example, another meta platform, Instagram, is able to detect and remove nudity automatically, it's perfectly possible for Facebook to engineer their system to get rid of this stuff completely. Right? Do you feel that they are hiding behind complexity in the law and ignoring their capability and wider duties of society to get away with the bare minimum?
I think you're right that the capability is often there and being used for different purposes. So, for example, there's a lot of information on which users are likely to be under the age of 18.
Yeah.
Through tracking how people are using services and so on. But that isn't being used to call out that somebody has said that they're 18 and they're actually only 13, even though the company knows full well that they're very likely to be underage. So that's one example. There are many others where the technology is there, but it's not being used for safety. But that's the change we've got to drive. And this is a cultural change above all else. And so I think that, what is going to happen is that the business models are going to have to change, and some revenues that were being earned will not be earned. Children will not be able to be marketed to in the same way as they were before, because we'll know where they are. And the algorithms won't be as viral for them as they have been in the past, so they won't spend as long on the platform, hopefully. So this is the change we're going to be driving, and some of it is driving, and some of it is going to really stick and be very difficult to force through. But I do think more broadly, maybe you have to be an optimist to work on online safety at Ofcom. I do think the industry is seeing that things are changing, and the point of regulation is that we're creating a new standard for everyone. And a lot of the companies say to me in meetings, are you doing this for everyone? And our answer is yes. And that's very, very important. So simply having these benchmarks, something like age verification at aged 18, that has been nowhere up until now. It is becoming the norm, becoming slowly the norm.
Well,
and it's our job to push those cultural changes through.
I certainly hope so. I mean, certainly the people I interact with, their experience is that what they say and what they do are two very different things, and that they hide behind the fact that this is a great big amorphous organisation which they can't possibly control every single thing, and that these things leak through and all the rest of it. Whereas in fact, when it comes to their revenue, nothing leaks through, nothing gets through for free, right? And so there's a sort of a conflict there. I just wanted to ask you final two things. The conversation we had about meetings and you publicising meetings, I think is a kind of proxy for there being some kind of certification or sense for people about what kind of platform they're dealing with. Right? Every parent has a sense in their own mind from talking to other parents and kids and experience about which are the ones that are sort of okay and which are the ones which are awful. Right? Certainly in my parent group, Snapchat is deemed to be the worst one by far. And some of the others less worse. I mean, none of them are great. Right? So as you go through this process of regulation, will we have a sense that we're able to judge about levels of compliance as users, and in particular those of us who are looking after teenagers, about what the levels of compliance? Will it be like the British Board of Film Classification? You'll be able to say, this platform is safe, this one is not safe. Yeah. Right? And that's broadly where I think we're all kind of reached to. And that's not just about children, that's about misinformation, disinformation. Now, some of them have internally recognised this, so you've got community notes on X and all that, which is a bit dodgy anyway. But really, I think what people want from a regulator is a certification that says safe, not safe. Will we get there?
So that binary safe, not safe and certification isn't part of the framework of the Act, but what definitely is part of the Act and what we will do is transparency reporting from Ofcom, and we've got to do that annually, and this is where I think I want us to be saying very clearly, particularly I think for parents, the household name platforms that we all know that children are on, here is where they are in delivering on their safety duties. That sense of being able to explain to the public what is and is not happening is very, very important for us to be able to do as a regulator.
Non-compliant.
Yeah, and I don't think it will be binary, because I think our experience is going to be that it'll be safe in some areas and not doing enough in others. That's likely to be what we see.
Yeah, but that's non-compliant. I mean, we just saw a couple of months ago a big fuss about Roblox and young people being exposed to quite serious harms on Roblox. Yes. And video games have an age classification. We're obviously moving to age verification, but even within that, the 13 to 18 period is still a vulnerable time for young people. And having no sense of, I'm sorry, Dame Melanie, but having a slightly vague, well, they're all right in some bits, but not in other bits, and it doesn't allow me as a consumer to judge.
It won't work if it's vague, so it's got to be clear.
Okay. And then last thing I just wanted to ask you,
We need to move on.
Yeah, okay. Last thing I wanted to ask you about is the rise of the use of VPNs and the dark web, and how you're going to address the fact that some of these, particularly smaller platforms, may decide. I mean, if I'm abroad and I can't access my Netflix account because I'm abroad, I just switch on my VPN and I can. Right. So how are you going to deal with the VPN, and particularly the dark web, if some of the smaller, more harmful platforms move into that realm?
So there are good uses of VPNs, as you've just described, and the Act certainly doesn't.
That's a good use, because it's actually
condoning criminality.
I think it's not a crime, but it's evading terms and conditions. Really.
Let me be slightly clearer than I just was. There are good uses of VPNs. So, for example, university students who are abroad being able to access their university's portals when they're away. And the Act doesn't ban them or give any levers on that, or age gate them, or anything like that. And let's take the case of pornography and children. We know that most kids stumble across porn at a young age. The average age is 13, and 1 in 10 9-year-olds are finding porn online, which is horrific. But most of younger children in particular are stumbling across it, are absolutely baffled and don't know what to do and are incredibly ashamed. Having proper age verification at aged 18 will do a huge amount to prevent those children from accessing porn.
Having fought with Matt Hancock to make sure it was in the bill, I absolutely agree with you. But what I'm asking you about is avoidance. Yes. Am I able to use a VPN to get completely around the online safety bill?
Well, if as a very concerted 17-year-old who really wants to use a VPN to access a site they shouldn't, may well be able to. But a company that advertises, well, they will be able to.
That's a yes. I can use a VPN to get around the whole bill.
There isn't a technology. Individual users can use VPNs. There's nothing in the bill that blocks that. But a company, and remember, we regulate the companies, that has on their front page, which one of the companies we've taken out enforcement action against has done, saying you can get around it. Saying they basically geo-blocked the UK and then said, but you can get around it with a VPN. That is not consistent with the Online Safety Act. That is something that we would take a very dim view of.
Okay, sorry, last question. So if I'm offering my service via a VPN from a third-party territory, but nevertheless that is contravening the Act, then you are able to enforce against
That is
them.
a contravention of the Act, yes.
And if they're in a third-party territory and say, get stuffed, what can you do?
Well, we can take enforcement action against them.
But they're based overseas. What are they going to do?
Look, we should be very, very clear that some of this enforcement action is going to be very difficult indeed. But already we've seen a couple of companies geo-block the UK without advertising VPNs, highly risky companies. And they've decided, rather than comply, that they will just no longer offer their service to UK users. Now, that would be a great shame if it happened to services that we're all enjoying every day in our lives, but for small but risky platforms, it may well be an entirely appropriate response. There will be some that continue to take the mickey with the Online Safety Act. So we should be really honest that enforcing against small, overseas, intent on ignoring the law companies will be difficult, and at some point Ofcom will need to decide whether we pursue them through a foreign court or whether we turn our attention to something where the risk is greater and we can achieve more impact.
We could just switch them off.
We haven't. Well, we can certainly seek a court order. We can.
Yeah.
We can,
you can
absolutely.
Get BT, you control the pipes just to turn it off.
We've been looking very actively into exactly how that process needs to run so that we're ready to use it.
And are you are you transparent about that? Do you report that on these challenges, these issues with prosecutions? Are we aware of that?
So it's only just starting this, but one of the things...
But in future, because you did talk about reflecting new technologies and new threats and risks, and so in future, can we expect to hear the challenges that you are facing where you may need legislative or other support or enforcement support?
We absolutely want to be clear about the realities of implementing this Act. Right. And to be honest, if there's one area where we get concerned and where my board gets quite concerned is it's managing expectations. So a sense that the Act is there and therefore suddenly this is very straightforward and everything will be fine overnight. I don't think anyone in this room believes that, but sometimes we are concerned that the realities of this are perhaps not as well understood as they could be. So we're very, very happy to talk about this. But it's very early days to be talking about the realities of prosecution. Okay. We're getting ready on all of this. We will be pushing quite hard where risks are high.
Okay. Thank you. We spent a lot of time talking about the Online Safety Act. I think we're going to move, Emily is going to move us sort of...
It's a fantastic segue here, because we're talking about platforms based in other countries. Now, there have been reports from US officials that they have met with you about the Online Safety Act and its impact on their definition of free speech. Obviously, we have our own definition of free speech, and one that is very long in law and predates the forming of the US. So, and has served us well in those years. Is it true that the US officials came over to meet Ofcom to discuss the Online Safety Act? And what was discussed?
We've had a couple of meetings with members of the US administration or from the US Congress, but that's a very normal part of our work. And I think they've met government departments and various others in the UK as well. What we are always very happy to do is to explain our work, and that forms the major part of any of these discussions. And in particular, to be clear, as I was at the beginning of this hearing, that the Online Safety Act is targeted against illegal harms for everyone and then further protections of children, but that it doesn't seek to control legal free speech for adults in the way that some fear. And in particular, it doesn't stop anyone in the US saying anything online, provided that that's not available for British users, even if it's illegal in the UK, but perhaps legal in the US, which is sometimes the case for some forms of speech. So we're quite glad to have an opportunity to explain all of that. We go to Washington fairly regularly. I haven't done that recently, but I do it usually once a year. We talk to lawmakers from all sides of the debate. There's a lot of interest in what Ofcom's doing. Sometimes we have, quite detailed technical discussions about how you can do age verification without compromising privacy, for example. But it's a really important part of our job to engage in those discussions.
In those discussions that you've had recently and over years, what do you think the main difference between the UK government's and regulators' approach to online safety and the US's?
I think freedom of speech reads differently in different countries, and one of the things we're constantly trying to convey is that actually this Parliament is pretty concerned about freedom of speech as well. It's built into everything Ofcom has to consider as a public body, and it's built into the Online Safety Act, and we may not have a First Amendment, but we have laws in our country as well, and it's a very important part of what we do. I think the other debate is the one I was just hinting at, which is what as the Americans would pronounce it, privacy. There's been a lot of scepticism, including from regulators as well as people in Congress, about whether or not age verification can be done in a way that secures privacy. And we believe it can. We've put in place rules that assume that, and we're now demonstrating that, and the conversation is beginning to change. Some of the reason there's been that reluctance is a lot of lobbying by some of the companies saying that age verification can only be done at the device level, for example. But we've got the evidence, we go out, we do the engagement, including with the porn industry, for example, and I think when things start to change in reality, you begin to win the argument.
Right. And do you feel pressured in these conversations to take a more US-based approach to some of these issues than a UK-based one? Is that the purpose of these meetings from their perspective?
No, we do not feel any pressure. I mean, it is not the purpose of the meeting from our perspective. The purpose of the meeting from our perspective is to explain what we're doing. Because often there are, misapprehensions, misunderstandings that we can try to put right.
Do you think there's any appetite from the US to adopt some of the UK approach on this?
Well, the Kids Online Safety Act is live again in Congress. It's not quite the same as the Online Safety Act. It tries to do some of the same things. There is action in individual states as well. Mm-hmm. But to be honest, what we find is that those who do care about this in the US are quite pleased that the United Kingdom has acted in Parliament and that the regulator is taking it forward, because they see the UK model as one of the best ways of changing global practice. And the fact that we have the English language, we're very important to these companies. The Ofcom is seen as independent, objective. The fact that we have the right skills and experience, the technology staff and so on, is very persuasive in the industry and with other jurisdictions. And there's people kind of want the UK version of this to work because they're not entirely sure that there will be another that has the same impact.
Can you understand there's some skepticism about these interactions that Ofcom is having, particularly given some of the messages coming out of the administration around free speech, Europe and free speech, and links to potential trade deals? Now, just to say, obviously, it's very clear the government has set this out as a red line in terms of it, and we've seen that there was no softening of it in the trade deal that was negotiated with the US. But can you understand why this interaction, and perhaps again, when we come back to the meetings and transparency point, that might help dispel some of this view that you are being put under pressure by another country to soften the Online Safety Act?
So I'd actually turn it around the other way. I think that if we were allowing concerns about the view of the US administration to stop us from seeing the people that we think we need to see to do our jobs, that would be the concern I would have. So when people want to come and talk to us about our work, when we know that they may have a different perspective, but we have an evidence-based, factual conversation to have with them about what our Parliament has asked us to do and how we are discharging that, I think it's really important that those meetings go ahead. So I understand the perceptions, but I actually think if we don't do that engagement, that's when we're kowtowing to pressure.
Right. But being transparent about that engagement?
No, we have to.
Yes, but at some point it does start to have a chilling effect if we explain every single meeting that we're having. I mean, we've got 450 people working on online safety, and it is a really big part of their job to engage with companies, with experts, with technology firms, with civil society. And I honestly think that it could be quite a serious chilling effect on us, actually, as well, if we were to be asked to reveal details of every single person we're meeting. We do reveal conflicts, we do reveal hospitality and things like that, but not every single meeting.
We'll take
we've discussed that, and you're going to come back to us with ways of.
We will come back with.
We really do need to move on. We spent a large part of this session on the Online Safety Act, and Ofcom has a wide range of other powers and sectors, and particularly telecommunications, broadband, cybersecurity, and now we're going to move on to artificial intelligence, I believe, Lauren.
Thank you. So, what is your regulatory approach to AI?
Well, firstly, I'm really glad you've asked this question because, of course, it's very pertinent at the moment and affects not only what we're doing in online safety, but as the Chair says, our broad remit. We've always taken a technology-neutral approach to AI. As you'll be well aware, AI has been around for a long time, but, of course, the rapid deployment means that there are some very important questions being asked at pace. So our regulatory approach, is technology neutral, which enables us to focus on outcomes. What are the outcomes for consumers? What are the outcomes for the market? And specifically in the context of AI, what we've tried to do is provide advice and guidance as early as possible to companies that we regulate, to consumers, to make sure that there is the transparency there. You might have seen the open letter that was issued on Gen AI at the end of last year. I'm more than happy to talk about that. But then we are also working closely with academics, with experts to understand how AI is changing the sectors that we regulate, so particularly telecoms, for example, and the work that we do on spectrum. But happy to take any questions on any of those areas.
No, so I guess the next question, will you be using AI to help monitor the AI, and you're kind of using that against
I mean, again, it's a great question, and a question that pretty much every organisation in the country is asking itself. Ofcom takes pride in being at the forefront of technology, both in terms of its serious implications for society, but also the opportunities that it gives all of us. And within Ofcom, we are looking at ways that we can use AI to improve our efficiency and our effectiveness. So, for example, in how we give out spectrum and plan for spectrum management, but also on how we do consultations. But I should emphasise we do that very much with guardrails in place. We see the opportunities, but we also see the concerns. So again, like every organisation, it's about getting that balance. It's about making the most of the opportunity, but making sure there are the guardrails in place. And ultimately, there's always a human at the end of the process.
Right. Thank you.
Happy to move on to rural.
Do you, you told our, Melanie, you told our predecessor committee that you had the resources to cover the existing remit on AI, but would face problems if asked to do more. And I guess I'm unclear as to whether you feel that you are being asked to do more in terms of regulating AI.
So we're not being asked to do more on regulating AI specifically at the moment. We're just being asked to implement the Online Safety Act, which of course requires huge regard to be had to particularly generative AI and the way that it's currently transforming services in ways that add risk and also add opportunity. But when it comes to the government's sort of AI strategy, I think as Natalie was just saying, if you're trying to regulate a technology, you can quite quickly end up with something that's a bit out of date. And also, it's a bit like maybe regulating electricity sort of 100, 150 years ago. It's just too broad, it's too whole economy. So I don't think that would be something that Ofcom would be well placed to do, even if it were decided that you were going to have a framework like that. But what we do as the communications regulator across all our sectors, and we have to do this, is think about how AI is, as I said, transforming risk and opportunity. It's very obvious in online safety, the use of large language models and chatbots, etc. But it's also very central to how telecoms, broadcasting, and the creative industries and spectrum management are developing. So that's not necessarily regulating the technology, but it's having regard to how the technology is increasingly changing the regulatory challenge.
And so in the context of your existing duties, and so as we've discussed, misinformation is not a duty, that is not a harm that is regulated when it comes to adults, and that applies to when that is generated by chat GPT or by AI as well. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go back to Lauren now, yes?
Thank you. So in Grovesham, I have 80% of the landmass, which is rural area. Now, they have a terrible time with getting broadband, mobile phone signal. It really is off the grid. Yet Gravesend has some broadband. So is it acceptable that about 50% of the premises in rural areas have access, whereas the urban areas it's about 87%. Looking forward at the charging of BT Openreach, which costs about 20 times more for rural installation, are you looking at this as a way to help improve rural connectivity?
Well, firstly, I think we've probably all got quite personal experiences of challenges in connectivity. And the reality is if we want a successful economy and one that's focused on economic growth, we need to make sure we've got the digital infrastructure in place to support that. There is a British success story here, which sometimes I think gets forgotten. Some of you will be familiar with these stats, but in 2018, only 6% of the country had access to full fibre. Today, that's 74%. The challenge, though, as you say, is the split often between rural and urban. But what we are seeing is a faster take-up of full fibre in rural areas. So, of course, that demonstrates the demand. Our role in Ofcom is to help stimulate competition to drive the build of full fibre. We now have the fastest build here in the UK, anywhere else in Europe. So I do think that's something to be proud of.
Fastest rollout.
Fastest build, yes, in Europe.
Build, but coming from a
very hence
so
my
we're
2018 stat.
Yes.
Know, but that's a success story. Ofcom's role focuses on those areas where it is competitive to build, where the numbers stack up. The challenge often in rural areas is it's incredibly expensive. And we work hand in glove with BD UK, who are responsible for that build out. And as a consequence, they have used some of our measures that we have developed with industry. So, for example, using the ducts and poles required to build out broadband. And today, BD UK have provided I think it's 1 million gigabit connections, but there is still a lot of work to do. And ultimately, we need a fully connected country. So we're certainly playing our part, but it's got to be a partnership with others as well.
Can I just ask a point on that? Just very quickly, just on that. I mean, certainly in my large rural constituency, the voices have gone quiet because of Starlink. Right, that's solved the problem for lots of people. Just on the mobile phone coverage thing, my memory was that this was going to be revolutionised by the rollout of the airwave or the replacement for airwave for the emergency services. That they were building a comprehensive 5G network effectively across the whole UK.
Don't take us back to airwave.
No. I don't know what the interplay is between that and because originally all the masts were going to be given to EE initially, and then everybody else was going to be on them. Won't that cover all those rural areas?
So I won't go over the history of airwaves because but the focus is on the delivery of the shared rural network. So I've just been talking about broadband. You've rightly raised mobile. And the programme there to address those really challenging areas and not spots is the shared rural network. That was set up in 2020 where there's agreement with the 4 mobile operators that as part of their licensing requirements, they needed to build out rural coverage. That has been successful in terms of going from around 80 to 88% across the country now. But we recognise at Ofcom that the way you use your mobile has fundamentally changed, particularly over the last 5 years. And so one of the things that we are doing actually at the end of next month is publishing new data that consumers can use to better identify those providers who are going to service them well, particularly in harder to reach areas. And so in due course, we'd want to write to the committee to explain some of that.
So we could have an update on airwave, actually. I mean, the reason I'm reluctant, as you are, Natalie Black, to go there is because it was a long and torturous experience, which I experienced both in Ofcom, actually, and as a Member of Parliament. But perhaps to satisfy our curiosity and perhaps to learn some lessons, we could have an update on that.
Of course.
Can I just follow up on a question that wasn't answered? So about the cost of installation.
Yes.
Are you looking to review that or keeping it as is?
Installation in rural areas.
Yes.
So currently that's a government led programme in terms of the BD UK Project Gigabit. So we are.
I think Lauren was talking about the regulation of OpenReach in terms of what it charges for duct and other access.
Right. Okay.
So that's your responsibility.
Apologies. Yes. So we are currently conducting the Telecoms Access Review. This is a review of the market we do every 5 years. And as part of that, we are looking at the remedies that we have in place to make the market as competitive as possible. And that includes what OpenReach charges to AltNet. So these are the challenger companies to build out. But overall, I think it's worth reflecting that broadband in the UK is now the cheapest in Europe, along with Italy. So we have overall seen a good outcome for consumers. But in terms of ensuring that the market is competitive to encourage this build that we want to see across the country, we absolutely are looking at wholesale prices.
Yes,
I wonder whether when you were talking about 20 times the price, you were talking about requests for people to have connections under the universal service obligation of 10
I think we're talking about per
megabits.
home. It's understandable if the distances are larger than the cost to drive it out, not the cost for...
And to be clear, Openreach is not allowed to charge different pricing by different areas for any reason, so the price is the price. But clearly, for them to pass particular homes is more expensive in some areas. They've actually done quite well in doing more rural build than they expected. We had it was a condition of our review 4 years ago, that they pass a certain number of rural homes, and they did that quite quickly. But there's no question that in some areas it is very expensive and is going to need the government to step forward with funding. But those prices should not be passed on to the consumer in any event.
I think, thank you for that. I think for most people living in rural areas, the fact that we have some of the lowest prices for broadband is not going to be helpful. I recognise that it's a good outcome overall, but actually what people in rural areas need, and for the country to have that ubiquity of access which will drive economic growth and skills, etc., we also need to take very seriously the challenge of rural broadband. And I think what you're saying is that you are doing so, but not through the regulation of Openreach pricing.
But if I may add, Chair, one of the things that we are doing at Ofcom is helping to stimulate innovation in this area. So, for example, direct-to-device communication, which will be able to help rural areas. Some of you might have seen recently the example of satellite phone call that was done by Vodafone. That was actually enabled by an innovation license granted by Ofcom. We've granted over 760 innovation licenses. Okay. So I think it's important, it's the combination of things that we can do. It's the regulatory levers that we have and making the most of those, but it's also about playing our part in the innovation economy and giving, particularly companies in the UK, the opportunity to come forward and try different things.
It's very interesting, and I knew that we would be spending a lot of time on the Online Safety Act, and then we would have less time to consider all the other really important and interesting things you do, such as innovation in rural broadband. Do we have a hard stop at 11:30, or can we? I think the session is planned to go on till midday.
We're in your hands, I think.
Excellent. Well, we may take a bit more time then, in which case, because I will come on to this. You've talked about competition, which is part of your remit, stimulating competition, and you've also said that if effective competition is developed by 2031, which I guess is only 6 years away now, you would feel no need to regulate Openreach. Can you tell us what you mean by effective competition and how likely this is?
So what we are looking at through the Telecoms Access Review, which I mentioned previously, is how we see sustainable competition developing in the market. So the outcome we are trying to achieve is full fibre rollout across the UK. And to do that, we have stimulated competition. So you have Openreach building, but also these challenger companies, of which there are now many in the UK. We look across the UK to see where we are seeing more than one or two challengers appearing. And it now looks like, for example, previously when we looked at this nearly 5 years ago, 70% of the country had potential sustainable competition. Now it looks like 90%. And what we have set out in the Telecoms Access Review is a signpost that when it comes to 2031...
Let's just clarify this then. So you're saying that 90% of the country, it is possible that you would have 2 to 3 fibre networks to your home?
To have an alternative, at least one alternative to Openreach. 2
fibre networks to your home?
At least one alternative to Openreach.
Well, that means
and in some cases, more than one.
Does 1 plus 1 not
fibre.
2?
Sorry, apologies if I'm not clear. What we have seen when we've looked at the rollout from companies in terms of their plans for the UK is that as an alternative to Openreach, we are seeing that now in 90% of the country there is the potential to have one alternative, And actually, in many other parts of the country, it could even be 2.
Just to clarify, but this is with OpenReach having already rolled out, or already have a connection. So it's 2 physical connections to the home.
Yes, exactly.
Not using the same
So it's
pipe.
not using the same pipe.
In many cases, it is using the same pipe, yes, because that's part of our...
And unbelievable. The whole of North London only has one.
It would usually be passing, so when we're saying that fibre is available, it would usually be passing the home in the ducts or poles down the street or
within
overhead.
like 20 yards.
The customer might decide to switch network, and that's something that we've put in much stronger kind of requirements around switching networks, and not just retail provider.
So,
but that's when you get it hooked up to your wall.
I have to say there's a little bit of scepticism that 80 to 90% of the country it can have
it's already 70%.
Yeah.
70%. This is by number of households. This is by households, not by geographic area.
Many don't have a connection.
So I think perhaps we could.
Please, can I emphasise its potential? So what we are doing in the Telecoms Access Review at the moment is trying to anticipate what the market is going to look like by 2031. And to do that, we have talked to all the companies who are operating at the moment and reviewed their plans. But it is potential.
It's potential, but you would not.
Clarification: is that FTP or FTC?
FTP, yes. So fibre to the premises, fibre.
2 possible connections to their own. I find
By
that
2031, and that only if that happened would you then consider not regulating OpenReach?
I think the test for us is sustainable competition, and there are a whole range of factors that we would need to look at that point. But this is looking some time ahead. This is to 2031.
Yes.
And it's not about no regulation either. We'll have to judge where there might still be significant market power for OpenReach and where there isn't. But we are increasingly confident that in large parts of the country there will be at least some competition there on a long-term basis. So
That's very interesting.
The numbers you were just talking about have given us some, again, perplexion. Could you possibly back that up with something in writing to us,
Of course,
please?
very happy to.
Good point.
To explain.
Good point, Martin. And to come on to another aspect of Ofcom's regulation of OpenReach. Now, you said that OpenReach should not incur necessary costs for running 2 networks at the same time. Now, you're basically talking about PSTN switch-off there, aren't you? Which has caused a lot of concern, and there have been really tragic cases of elderly and vulnerable who have been left without access to emergency services. Can you just say how much OpenReach are going to save from turning off the PSTN, and how you are ensuring that that is done safely and with consideration for the well-being, particularly of the vulnerable, and information, because there hasn't really been very much information about it, has there?
Well, firstly, again, I'm glad you've raised this because this is a very difficult and complex problem. And as you say, Chair, there have been some very, very sad cases associated with it. There are about 5 million people still on the PSTN, so there is quite a sustained programme of work. We have been working very closely with government to make sure that this is done carefully, and you'll be aware the programme was previously paused last year.
Yes.
And then Minister Chris Bryant developed a checklist for non-voluntary transfers to make sure the right measures were in place.
Would you agree that before that pause, it wasn't being done carefully and there was not sufficient requirement for to work with government or to inform consumers?
Well, perhaps the history which I recall from certainly from 2020. I mean, Ofcom put in place guidance to the industry as early as 2018, I believe, which said that you must take care to protect vulnerable customers.
Either that did not happen, or
I think what didn't happen was that there wasn't very much switch off of the PSTN in the early years. But in 2022, we began to get very concerned that BT's transition was not going well, that they were not sufficiently aware of what it was like for customers, particularly who maybe have signed up to fibre and didn't realise that their PSTN phone line was going to be switched off at the same time. And we had some quite serious conversations. I had some of those with the senior management at BT, and they paused their migration at that point, actually, and reset it.
So it wasn't working, and then it was...
No, I think it needed a lot more attention than it was getting. But then I think what the government has done more recently has had another impact, particularly as we start to get to the... it's 5 million consumers, but a lot of those for whom it's easy to switch have now already done it. You're increasingly getting into a more vulnerable group of people.
So how much will open?
Well, I wanted to come back to your question. I'm afraid I haven't got that number to hand, but very happy to follow up for you.
Right. Okay. That's great. I think there are obviously ongoing concerns with the impact of switching off the PSTN, and I'd be very interested to hear how you see that evolving. So now we're going to move to another area that Ofcom has huge responsibility in, which is the risks in relation to cybersecurity and resilience. I'm particularly interested here that Ofcom has received only one reported incident in 2022 and none in 2021 and 2023 with regards to cybersecurity and resilience. And we see as you yourselves mentioned, we see the attacks on our retail sector. I mean, is it that they're not attacking our telecoms and networks, or that they're not being reported?
I might just clarify that, if that's all right, Chair. If I've understood correctly, that one notification will be under NIS, so under the Network Information Systems.
Yes.
But we are also responsible for implementing the Telecom Security Act, and we've had a lot more notifications in that space. The NIS is relatively narrow in its definition. It focuses on digital infrastructure, and we regulate a small group of companies under that legislation. But the Telecoms Security Act, that's where our real cyber powers sit. We regulate 40 companies there, and we've had 15 notifications which relate to denial of service, ransomware, the typical things that unfortunately you see in cyber security attacks.
Yeah, we'll come on to network security, the telecom sector specifically, but when it comes to the NIS notifications, do you feel that one in 3 years is a true reflection of the resilience and security of those networks that you're regulating?
So I'll be very honest, I'm quite new in this job. I've been in place for 6 months, and certainly I found that interesting. But you will be aware that with the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill coming forward, that will change the definition and scope of some of the NIS requirements. And I think we welcome that. The challenge is this space is moving so quickly, and so trying to stay ahead of the threat is quite difficult. And the opportunity that is coming up in the Cybersecurity Resilience Bill, one of those things will mean that scope won't have to be amended through legislation, which will give us more flexibility.
You've seen that in the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill.
I understand that's being
You
planned.
understand? Okay, so I don't think we've seen. Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you very much. I think I'm struggling to keep up. It's been quite a while since I was building telecoms networks, having started in the early 90s with Orange UK. So you have these reports. You were talking earlier. These reports of breaches. Do you think the network's taking it seriously?
So in terms of how we engage with the companies and what we've seen, yes. Part of the requirements, as I mentioned earlier, under the Telecom Security Act, we wrote to the Secretary of State at DSIS earlier this year, and our view was that we're making progress. They're taking the requirements seriously, but there's a lot more to do. The nature of the threat is changing. The way that technology is being used in telecoms is changing, going back to our point about AI. But there are very real-world implications, as we're all seeing only too well at the moment. So, in summary, I do think they're taking it seriously, but there is more to do.
How do you monitor? How do you get the picture of what's going on, and what sort of steps are you taking to make sure that it is moving fast enough to actually keep pace?
Well, firstly, I should emphasise this as a partnership approach. So we work very closely with government, but we also particularly work closely with the National Cyber Security Centre. And they drafted the codes of practice that we are then responsible for monitoring. They share information with us in terms of how the threat environment is changing, and we have ongoing dialogue with all the relevant companies, as I mentioned, 40 under the Telecom Security Act, to understand how their networks are developing, the kind of threats that they are seeing, and then encouraging sharing across the sector. And again, the NCSC plays an important part in that.
With this development of shared networks and shared network infrastructure, which is what I imagine is going on there, is that complicating it, or is the responsibilities clear in that for cybersecurity?
I think the responsibilities are very clear, and the NCSC plays an excellent role in terms of convening all different interested parties. But undoubtedly, the nature of digital infrastructure is getting more complicated. I mean, I think that's what we've just seen in Spain and Portugal in terms of some of the resilience issues taking place there. So we're not complacent at all in terms of how challenging this is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Emily.
So I wanted to come back to the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. In particular, you are obviously looking forward at the future at both the technology development. I want to understand your assessment of the current risk level on cybersecurity, in particular in relation to foreign actors.
So I think firstly I should start with the government obviously sets the threshold, and GCHQ is the lead there, who then through the NCSC communicate that to all interested stakeholders. But at least from what we see at Ofcom, there is a lot of activity by nefarious actors, but that can be quite wide-ranging, both in terms of its impact, but also whereabouts it affects digital infrastructure.
And where do you see the greatest weaknesses within the areas that you look at?
So through the code of practice, we, working hand in glove with the National Cyber Security Centre, recognise it's quite familiar across infrastructure, whether that's in telecoms or other parts of the economy. It's, as ever, it's your own employees, making sure that they have the necessary training, they're using two-factor authentication, for example. Secondly, it's the design of the infrastructure, designing security from the beginning so that it's not an add-on. And then thirdly, I'd probably highlight the use of third-party suppliers, which is always challenging, and that's one of the areas that we look at through the Telecom Security Act.
So in your conversations with DCIT on the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, do you think those three areas of potential weakness are being properly addressed?
So just so I'm clear, when I say weakness, those are threats that we see across the economy that are evolving all the time.
They're the soft points.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There are measures in place already through NIS and through the Telecom Security Act. But the Cybersecurity Resilience Bill is an opportunity to make sure that we don't rest on our laurels and we evolve both how we look at these threats and the powers that we have to deal with them. So I think that's a long way of me saying that we can always be better in this space. That's the challenge of cybersecurity.
So this is your opportunity to lobby lawmakers here, right? We're going to have to vote on this bill. What do we need to be looking at to give us that hardening of those soft zones within the cybersecurity bill from your perspective?
Melanie might want
Melanie
to come in here, but I would start with this is a team sport. And the fact is we all have to work together in partnership, and the Cybersecurity Resilience Bill is an opportunity to make sure that everyone who is involved have the powers that they need. So that would be one thing to look at.
And I think our expectation is that the bill will look at new sectors such as data centres, for example, that need to be covered, as well as how the existing rules are working. What we've said to government is we're happy at Ofcom, we can do more in some of these spaces to build on the capability that Natalie and her team already have on telecom security. We can do a bigger role on NIS, and I think the government this morning, actually, I think Chris Bryant is going to be confirming that they're going to ask Ofcom to take on the data centre role. There'll be other regulators that take on other parts of the expanded NIS regime. So I think it is a very, very multi-agency approach, this, though. And the GCHQ role here is, and the NCSC role is so important. So just to really kind of bring home what Natalie's already been saying, the government writes the codes of practice for the telecom security regime, not Ofcom as the regulator. Our role is to implement, because they're the ones that have the understanding of the threat. And that, I think, will thread its way through the new rules, and it's the right approach. But clarity about roles and responsibilities is always something important as we're getting the legislation right.
So just finally, we are the Science, Tech, Innovation and Technology Committee, so we love to talk about the new and exciting technologies emerging, quantum technologies, 6G, and obviously the increasing importance of satellite technology when it comes to telecoms. Do you think that the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill is properly understanding and future-proofing for these emerging technologies that have fantastic potential but also can...
Well, I mean, this is a personal view, but I don't think there's any such thing as future-proofing, I'm afraid. It's the environment that we live in. So instead, it's about making sure the UK is at the forefront of innovation. So you mentioned 6G, for example. We're looking at how, at Ofcom, how we will dispel the upper 6 gigahertz band to make the most of the opportunity for the potential of 6G going forward. You mentioned quantum. We work with the National Computer Quantum Centre, which you all know well, but hand in glove, and that's how we operate at Ofcom. It's both looking at the opportunities, but also making sure that we're addressing the challenges side by side, and that's how we look at them in my team across the full waterfront.
Thank you.
I just think the satellite point's a really important point.
Yes.
Given it's a national security, it can be a national security issue, a cyber security issue, and the potential the connection to telecoms. Do you want to say anything about the nature of some of the behaviour of these satellite firms that do present particular challenges on these areas?
So I would say that through our Spectrum team, we work with the satellite companies. There are currently 8 of the lower orbit satellite companies licensed through Ofcom in the UK. There's only one operating who's providing broadband, who's been mentioned already. But when you think about the telecom strategy for the UK, inevitably satellite's got to play a big part in that, for all the reasons we've mentioned before about rural communities. So we are thinking about what needs to be the long-term strategy here to ensure that we get the best for British consumers. As you say, there are some behaviours there, but we're used to dealing with those behaviours in other elements of our remit. And it's one of the great strengths of Ofcom that these companies now operate in many different parts of the UK economy. But we get to see them and understand their behaviours and have the expertise to deal with them because we have so much experience in this space now.
And I'll just add that low Earth orbit satellites, it's a scale business, and I think there are really serious competition issues, but they are global competition issues.
Right.
Ofcom represents the UK with close collaboration with the government in the world, in the ITU and in World Radio Congresses, as you'll know. We're strong in those fora. We're recognised for our technical expertise. We've got a good team there. But fundamentally, there are some big debates to play out between the traditional satellite operators and the new players here, and some big questions of competition. What we're doing in the UK is that we're making sure that when we're licensing operators in the UK, we are putting conditions in that means that at the local level, there is competition provided for. So, for example, if you have a satellite in one home, that you haven't configured it in a way that prevents another operator from selling one to the neighbour. Yep. So we're doing what we can at that local level because I think in the end competition it doesn't always work, but competition is a good sort of it's a cleaning and transparency mechanism that can help. I'm not saying it achieves everything.
I completely agree. I mean, we need a high seas of the high space or high whatever we want to call it.
Maybe an issue for science diplomacy.
Exactly,
well.
I agree.
Can I just follow up? Thank you very much, Emily. Can I just follow up Emily's questions with two specific questions around this area? It's not really a new technology, but the Internet of Things is obviously communications, telecommunications, and everything from our toothbrushes to our smart meters to our increasingly also in autonomous vehicles, etc. Does Ofcom regulate the Internet of Things?
No, we don't, but there will be touch points that would affect some of our frameworks. So you mentioned smart meters, for example. Smart meters predominantly connect through the elements of 2G, 3G at the moment, and as part of the 2G, 3G switch off, we are working with government to understand the impact. So we don't have broad ranging commitments, but it certainly interacts with our work.
You don't regulate the Internet of Things in the extent to which it communicates with non-2G or 3G, Bluetooth?
No, it would be the interaction with the telecoms system.
Right, okay, that's interesting. And one of the requirements under the Telecoms Security Act is to reduce supply chain risks. Does Ofcom take a role in that, in looking at supply chain risks?
Yes, we do. It's one of the measures under the Code of Practice. And then, of course...
How are we doing in reducing supply chain risks? And also, have the example of Huawei being torn out of our systems, which is extremely painful and extremely costly. Are we heading for another such problem?
Well, specifically on Huawei, you'll be aware that the government has set out that Huawei needs to be removed from 5G kit in the UK by 2027. The role of Ofcom there is supporting monitoring. So there are a number of companies that have been identified by the government who have to report on how that is progressing. But government takes a whole view. We are providing a monitoring support there. But you're right to highlight that supply chain risk is an ongoing issue. And so that's the case that gets a lot of attention, but actually there's a whole range of supply chain threats that also need to be considered, and that's what we do.
Are you monitoring them?
Through the Telecom Security Act as far as we can. But my understanding is that with the new cybersecurity resilience bill, additional measures will be added on supply chains.
What's the biggest supply chain risk that you see now?
Probably third-party vendors. Again, with the very live cybersecurity incidents, that's something that obviously a lot of experts are talking about. But whenever you're building infrastructure, it's always difficult because you can't control everything, and it's your interactions with third parties which are challenging.
Thank you. We are just coming to two or three more questions, and looking generally at Ofcom and Ofcom funding. But I do have to ask you, Dame Melanie Dawes, that you've marked 5 years in your role as Chief Executive of Ofcom. Congratulations. How would you rate your performance, and how long do you expect to remain?
Well, look, I think it's for my board and others to judge my performance.
Very diplomatic answer.
But I love this job. It's incredibly interesting. It's really important what we do, and over the next few years, definitely on online safety, but also in other areas such as telecoms access review, satellite. I'll work on public service broadcasting. There's a lot for me that I still want to be part of, and I work with brilliant colleagues as well, and my board supports me in that.
Thank you very much. Adam.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you again, both. Moving on to the spending review. that's coming up and kind of your position within the spending review. At the moment, in your view, are you under pressure from the government to cut costs as part of the spending review?
Because Ofcom's funded by fees, either from our industries or through spectrum licences, we are not part of the public expenditure framework, so we're not part of this spending review process at the moment. We have had discussions with the government about our budget for the next few years, and we've concluded what we believe to be a satisfactory outcome to that allows us to get on with the job. The context is that since 2009 we've had a flat cash budget in all but 1 year, up until the year that just finished, on our core traditional Ofcom work. So where we've had new duties, we've had extra funding, but the core has been flat. Obviously, when you're bringing in new duties, it enables you to be more efficient because those overheads can be shared more widely. So that's always useful for us. But we've got so we've had to make very significant efficiencies. It's a 40% overall cut over that period, and we've done that by consolidating in our estates. Significantly fewer floors in Riverside House than the chair may remember from her time at Ofcom in the early 2000s, for example, and also by all of the things you would expect around contracts and expenses and all of those other parts of corporate costs.
Okay.
Just to clarify, you've agreed your spending cap with the spending review, because whilst you do raise money through fees, etc., there's an overall spending cap which covers everything.
The overall number, and within that, the online safety budget is separately identified because that fee regime hasn't come in yet.
Yeah, I mean, on that latter point, actually, the online safety regime, the government's funding this at the moment, I understand, until it's up and running in 26, 27. Do you have any ideas about whether that's going to be impacted in the spending review?
We're not expecting it to be impacted in the spending review. Obviously, what we've got to do is get the fee regime in place, and this is about asking some big tech companies to pay our costs. They haven't done that before.
I think it's Facebook's revenues are 1.9 or 1.3 trillion. How much do you think you'll be asking them to pay you?
Well, overall, our online safety budget for next year is £72.5 million a year. £2.5 million a year, and in the subsequent years it will be broadly flat from here on in with a small inflation adjustment. So we're reasonably stable, at least for now, in our funding, and that will be paid for by the companies we regulate, particularly the larger ones. What we've got to do to finalise that is do the statutory instruments on the thresholds above which you should come into scope, because we don't want lots and lots of very small companies paying small amounts. It will be a small number paying larger amounts. And the statements of charging principles and so on that go alongside that. And we're expecting to sort of finalise that in the next few weeks, probably after.
Do you have an approximate idea about where those thresholds are likely to be? You know, how big companies are we looking at here?
We've set out proposals here for consultation, and I'm happy to confirm that. To be honest, it may be best if we just send you what we're going to do in the next few weeks when we do it, and we're happy to explain it if that's helpful.
That's absolutely fine. Yeah, we'd appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. And last a couple of questions about growth, which is a requirement placed on Ofcom to support the government in its focus on growth. And in the response to the government's request for ideas to boost economic growth, you mentioned the need for regulators to innovate. So what innovations is Ofcom currently undertaking to boost growth?
So I think it's in two parts, really. First, how we innovate in our regulation. So I think there the best example is the work that we've done on spectrum licensing over the last few years. So, for example, to license the direct-to-device pilots that Natalie was talking about earlier has required a lot of innovation from our teams about thinking how to do that, because normally when you're licensing spectrum, you're licensing a fixed UK-based, on-the-ground kind of installation. So we've had to find quite creative ways to go around that. We're increasingly also again, as Natalie was referring to earlier, supporting through sandboxes and so on, new ways of using spectrum so that we can stay ahead of the curve. Innovation is absolutely central to that area of Ofcom's work. But more broadly on growth, what we're doing on fibre rollout is absolutely central to the economy in so many different ways. So
yes,
we believe that we contribute a lot to the future productive potential of the economy, to serving citizens and consumers in the future and not just today. Our overall duties are cast broadly, which allows us to take that rounded view when we make decisions. And going back to broadband, to prioritise investment in this period, and not just to prioritise the lowest possible prices. Right. So I think we feel very enabled as a regulator to prioritise growth, but we've welcomed the challenge of whether we're doing enough. And we're constantly working on that. Our board has taken it very seriously as well.
Great. It's very good to hear. And in your response, you also you referenced highly valuable spectrum awards as a growth-driving measure. And you've just sort of mentioned the direct-to-device spectrum. But the last award raised just over £1 billion. Now, would you expect to raise much from any future awards that might help fill the Chancellor's spending requirements?
Yes, that was the 5G spectrum back in 2021, I think it was. So we don't have targets for pricing or the auction. The whole point of an auction is it's a widely internationally recognised way of allowing an industry collectively and fairly to bid and to set the price for scarce assets. So maybe I would expect that, particularly where we're auctioning, high in demand spectrum, that there will be revenue for the government coffers.
Yeah, we've got the 1.4 gigahertz coming up this year, as well as high capacity. But if I may, Chair, it's also not just the metric that you're mentioning in terms of how much is raised from the spectrum auction, but it's also as an enabler, yes, more broadly. So when we look at shared use of 5G, for example, as Melanie was describing, some of the innovations that we've done there has enabled a growth of private networks for companies like JLR and Solihull to do advanced manufacturing in a way that hasn't been possible before. So I'd suggest there's sort of two metrics that you would want to look at there.
Right, the amounts raised and also the how it drives technology rollout.
What you enable in
increased productivity specifically. Yeah. Great. Well, I think that's a very good note on which to end. How Ofcom is driving not only fundraising for the government's coffers, but productivity. We've talked along a wide range of subjects, so all within Ofcom's very wide remit. I really want to thank you for giving your time to us today. It's been extremely interesting. You've taken us through a wide remit. You say, Dame Melanie Dawes, that you love your job. I hope you do too, Natalie Black. And can I just also add, it's great to have an all-female panel. It's not often something that we get when it comes to tech panels. So I'm glad to see that you both enjoy your jobs. You have very challenging roles, and we really appreciated your sharing the challenges and the opportunities that you're facing with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Order.